Well, by far the most downloaded episode of my podcast, Press Play with Jeremy Scott, had to deal with the topic of why journalists won't provide questions before you come in for an interview. And there are a lot of reasons, but in this video, I'm going to give you the top 3. The first reason is very simple. Oftentimes, as a journalist, when I'm doing an interview, I simply don't know what questions I'm going to ask you until the conversation gets going. So part of the journalistic process is letting the interview go where it will. And so I might ask you a question based off of the answer you give me. And if I've submitted you questions in advance, it doesn't give me that flexibility to let the conversation play out. And so there's an actual practical reason why we don't do that in that regard. The second reason is because we don't want to be boxed in on certain questions if there's something that is relevant that I need to ask you about today. Oftentimes I've been asked a week out, hey, can you submit those questions? I say no, because a week's a long time. If something happens 10 hours before my interview, I have to be able to ask you about that. So I'm not going to lock myself in on questions a week in advance. The third reason is probably the hardest for people to understand. You do not have control of the interview. As a journalist, it's my job to ask those questions and to get the information from you. I'm not trying to trick you. This isn't a gotcha style, but you don't get to say what questions I can ask you. It's up to me to decide. You also don't control the narrative. Once the story is done, you don't get final approval. If you'd like to learn more about media strategy, you can listen to my podcast. It's called Press Play with Jeremy Scott. You can find it on Apple Music or Spotify. It's also on my website at scottmediatulsa.com.